My son said no to my life-saving surgery, then jetted to Hawaii. He never expected what my old box unleashed. It was my 65th birthday. No candles, no cake, no cheerful calls or well-wrapped surprises. Just me, a quiet living room, and a single envelope from the hospital resting heavy in my lap. Outside, snow was falling. Soft, slow, like it didn't have the heart to hurry. The flakes caught the edge of the window pane, clinging for a second before vanishing. I watched them, numb. The report had come from Dr. Peterson. Kind man, gentle voice. I still heard him clear as day. "Grace," he said, "the old injury in your lower back. From your years at Harbour Machinery, it's flared up, significantly." He tapped the scan. "Acute disc herniation. The disc is pressing dangerously on a nerve." I remember swallowing, hard. "If we don't operate soon," he said softly, "you risk losing your ability to walk. You could end up bedridden, in chronic, unmanageable pain." He hesitated, as if the words themselves were too harsh for the air between us. "The surgery is $35,000. I know it's a lot. But Grace, your quality of life matters. It's priceless." I nodded, pretending to be calm. But inside, I was already doing the math. My savings account held just over $10,000. My CD, my safety net, wouldn't mature for another 3 months. And cashing it early meant losing the interest I'd spent years earning. Years of working holidays, skipping takeout, wearing old coats. Years of putting everyone else first. I'd never liked asking for help. But this time, I had no choice. So I picked up the phone and called David, my eldest, my pride. The boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them golden roses. The man I put through school with blistered hands and aching feet. "Mum," he answered, distracted. Always busy these days. I told him about the surgery. I didn't beg. I simply explained. Quiet, measured, just the facts. There was a pause. Then came the scoff. "Mom, you always do physical therapy. That's worked before. Isn't this a little extreme? You know how doctors love to scare old people. Try massage or something natural. Don't jump to surgery." I told him, and again, what Dr. Peterson had said. I told him I might lose the ability to walk. Another pause. Shorter this time. Colder. "Look, Mum, things are tight. We just moved. We've got expenses. I don't have 10 grand lying around for this, as if this wasn't his mother's ability to walk. Use your savings if it's that bad," he added, his voice already drifting away. "Don't always come to us." Click. That was it. The phone slipped from my fingers and landed on the kitchen table with a dull thud. The same table where I'd packed his school lunches, helped him with homework, signed permission slips, and wiped away tears. Now it just echoed. For days I told myself to be reasonable, to understand, to forgive. Then came the photo. Bright, carefree. Palm trees in the background. David and Melissa, all smiles in their brand new resort wear. Sun-kissed and glowing. Her caption read, "Family unwind time in paradise, every penny well spent. Blessed." Paradise. While I lay in bed trying to roll over without wincing, I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I stood, slowly, painfully. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet, reached for the deep brown wooden box on the top shelf. The one I hadn't touched in 20 years. It wasn't filled with memories. It held my last resort. Old factory envelopes, a hidden account number, letters from a lawyer I'd quietly consulted a decade ago, back when I first felt the distance in my son's voice and thought, maybe I should be ready. That evening, I called the lawyer, told her I was activating everything, and then I called the bank, made changes, locked down what was mine. I removed David from everything, my will, my accounts. The emergency access I once gave him out of love and trust. Gone. Melissa wouldn't be sipping from coconuts on my dime. David wouldn't see a cent of the money I'd bled to earn. Instead, I left it where it would matter, a scholarship fund for trade school kids, a donation to Harbor's retirement union, a trust for the neighbor girl who shovels my walk and checks in every Wednesday, rain or shine. They thought I'd just endure, that I'd ache quietly, fade gently, but they forgot. I'm not just some frail old woman in need of saving. I'm Grace Eleanor Walker, and I've spent a lifetime building things, including a life strong enough to stand on its own. Let them enjoy their paradise, because I've just reclaimed mine. The click of the lawyer's confirmation, the crisp finality in the bank manager's voice after I'd made the changes. These sounds were like stones dropping into a deep, still well. Each one sent ripples through the frozen surface of my grief, not breaking it, but changing its texture. There was a grim satisfaction, yes, but beneath it, a current of sorrow still ran strong and cold. David was gone from my future, erased by his own hand, his laughter in Hawaii echoing as the sound of nails in the coffin of our relationship. But there was still Eric, my younger boy, the one who, despite his different path, had always sworn he'd be there. "Mom, don't worry," he'd said, grease smudged on his young, earnest face on the day he opened his garage. "I'll be able to take care of you too." Hope, that stubborn weed, pushed a tiny shoot through the permafrost of my despair. Maybe David was an anomaly. Maybe Eric would be different. I dialed his number, my breath catching. The line crackled, then his voice, rushed, impatient, like David's. "Mum, I'm in the middle of a business meeting. What's up?" In the background, I could hear the distinct whine of a new, high-end diagnostic machine, the kind that costs a small fortune, and then his muffled voice to someone else. "Yeah, tell him the new plasma cutter is arriving Thursday. Make space for it." So much for the business struggling, as he'd vaguely mentioned last Christmas. I swallowed, keeping my voice low, steady. "Eric, it's my back. The old injury. The doctor says I need surgery urgently, or I might not walk again. I need to borrow 10,000. A pause stretched, taut and suffocating. 2 seconds, maybe 3, each one an eternity. Then, blunt, unapologetic. "Can't, Mom. Honestly, the shop's been unpredictable lately. Loans, rent, overheads. It's suffocating." Suffocating. The word hung there. He, suffocating in his thriving business with its new toys, while I was suffocating with the fear of permanent paralysis. "And," he added, a new edge to his voice, "didn't you get hurt helping someone out with that truck a while back? Shouldn't he be paying for it? I really don't have that kind of money right now. Maybe ask one of the other relatives." My voice, when I found it, was a raw whisper. "Eric, please, just this once. Think about everything. Everything I did to get you through, to help you open that shop." Another sigh. This one weighted with theatrical weariness, not kindness. "Mom, I've got my own problems. Big ones. I've got to go. We'll talk later, okay?" The line went dead. Later. The universal dismissal. I placed the phone back on its cradle, the plastic cool against my palm. 2 sons, 2 calls, 2 betrayals, each a fresh stab in a heart already bleeding. The pain in my back throbbed, a dull, insistent reminder of its origins. Suddenly, I wasn't in my quiet kitchen anymore. I was 25 again, young Grace, a widow with 2 small boys to feed, standing on the oily floor of harbor machinery, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and sweat. I remembered lifting a heavy engine casing, a searing bolt of agony shooting through my lower back. I'd cried out, stumbling, but the foreman, old Henderson, just yelled, "Walker, pick up the pace. We ain't got all day." I'd straightened, biting back tears, the weight of the metal matched only by the weight of my responsibilities. David needed new shoes. Eric had a cough that wouldn't quit. There was no room for a doctor's visit, no money for weakness. That evening, alone in our cramped apartment after the boys were asleep, I'd pressed a hot compress to my aching spine, my silent tears mingling with the steam. That injury became a part of me, a dull ache that flared with fatigue, a constant reminder of the price of motherhood, a price I'd paid without complaint. Until now. Now, That old pain wasn't just physical, it was the agony of knowing those sacrifices meant nothing to the very children for whom they were made. A few days later, my neighbor, Martha, a woman whose kindness was as reliable as the sunrise, stopped by with a small pot of her famous chicken soup. She was a few years older than me, widowed too, and her eyes held a knowing sadness. She found me staring out the window, the untouched phone on the table. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Grace," she said gently, setting the soup down. I tried to smile, but it felt like cracking plaster. I didn't tell her everything, just mumbled about the surgery and the complexities. She patted my hand. "Complexities, is it? Funny how children become complexities when they grow up." My sister Sarah, God rest her soul, poured everything into her boy. Sent him to the best schools, bailed him out of trouble more times than I can count. When she got sick, really sick, needed someone to drive her to chemo, he was always too busy. Found out later he was busy renovating his lake house. She sighed, looking out the window with me. "Sometimes, Grace, the ones you give the most to are the ones who take the most for granted. Don't let them break you, dear. You're stronger than you think." Her words, simple and true, echoed what my heart was beginning to understand. The world hadn't ended with their refusals. It had just shifted. The path ahead was different, lonelier in one sense, but also clearer. My sons had made their choices. Now, it was time for me to make mine, not just with lawyers and bank accounts, but with my life. The surgery was still a looming mountain, and as Martha left, a name surfaced in my mind. A lifeline from the past. A man who understood loyalty and hard work. Bill Simmons, my old friend from Harbour Machinery. It was a long shot, asking an old co-worker, another retiree, but what did I have left to lose? My hand trembled as I dialed Bill Simmons's number, a number I hadn't called in years, not since his own wife, Clara, had been sick. What if he couldn't help? What if he too had his own struggles? The line rang, and then his familiar gruff voice, softened by age but still unmistakably Bill. "Grace? Well, I'll be. What's going on? Heard you were in the hospital." Just like that, no pretense, no hedging. I told him everything. The diagnosis, the cold refusals from David and Eric, the looming fear of the surgery costs. There was a moment of silence on his end, a silence so profound I thought the line had dropped. Then he cleared his throat. "Grace," he began, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "You remember when my Clara was down with that terrible pneumonia, barely able to lift her head?" Suddenly, I was back there 20 years ago, Bill, gaunt with worry, working double shifts to pay for Clara's care. And me, after a grueling 8 hours on the factory line, heading straight to their small apartment. I remembered spooning homemade chicken soup into Clara's frail mouth, changing her cool compresses, just sitting with her, holding her hand, and talking about silly things from the factory to distract her, while Bill was out driving a nightcab to make ends meet. I remembered the look in Bill's eyes when he'd come home, exhausted to find me there. Gratitude, raw and overwhelming. That was the Bill I knew. "Bill," I started, my voice catching, "you're retired now, just like me. I can't ask you to—" "Shut it, Grace," he barked, the old factory floor roar momentarily returning, though it was laced with warmth. "Don't you dare talk about asking. You think I've forgotten? Clara wouldn't have made it through that winter without you. You were there, Grace. No questions, no hesitation. 35 grand, you said?" He scoffed. "Consider it a down payment on what I owe you. Send me your bank account number. Your health comes first. And those boys of yours." He paused, and I could almost see him shaking his head. "If Hector were here, he'd have a thing or two to say to them, believe you me. You're not alone in this, Grace. Not while I'm still breathing." Tears welled in my eyes, the first I'd allowed myself since this whole nightmare began. Not tears of self-pity, but of overwhelming gratitude. The next day, the full amount for the surgery landed in my account. Just like that. No questions, no conditions, just help. A lifeline thrown by a friend, when my own flesh and blood had watched me drown. I scheduled the surgery immediately. The recovery was quiet, a blur of medication and physical therapy. Bill, true to his word, was a constant. He'd drop by every few days with fresh fruit or a container of something his new wife, a cheerful woman named Susan, had baked, insisting I try her latest creations. We'd sit and talk, not always about my health, but about old times at Harbour Machinery, about life, about the stubbornness of weeds in his tomato patch. It was easy, comfortable. His presence was a balm. My sons, however, were ghosts in my recovery. David sent the occasional perfunctory text, "How are you feeling today?" Eric even less. Never once did they ask how much the surgery had cost, if the bill had been paid, if I needed anything, a ride to a follow-up, a carton of milk from the store. Nothing. Their concern, it seemed, couldn't stretch beyond a few typed words on a tiny screen. It was as if my entire ordeal was a minor inconvenience to them, a storyline they'd muted. Lying in bed one afternoon, the pale sunlight striping the floor, I found my mind drifting back again to another sacrifice, one of many. I saw myself, much younger, standing before a shop window. Inside, a simple, elegant blue dress. Not fancy, but it was the first new dress I'd allowed myself to even dream of since Hector passed. I'd saved for it, penny by penny. I remember opening my worn wallet, counting the carefully folded bills. Then, a familiar pang of guilt. David needed new cleats for soccer. Eric had outgrown his winter coat. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, I turned from the blue dress and walked towards the children's store. The dress remained a ghost in a window. My sons got what they needed. Always. The clarity that came with recovery was sharp, almost painful. The lines were drawn now, not by blood, but by actions, by presence, by care. Bill was family. My sons, they were something else. Relatives, perhaps. Biological facts. But family. The word felt hollow when I thought of them. The changes I'd made with the lawyer, the ones I'd set in motion from my kitchen table, fueled by betrayal and the sight of a Hawaiian vacation, no longer felt like a rash decision. They felt like the only sane response to a lifetime of one-sided devotion. My 65th birthday was approaching, and an idea began to form, as solid and unyielding as the steel we used to shape at Harbour. It was time for a reckoning, not just in my bank accounts, but face to face. I would have a party, and they would all be invited. The weeks leading up to my 65th birthday passed in a haze of quiet healing and steely preparation. The physical pain from the surgery was receding, replaced by a resolute strength I hadn't felt in years. This party wasn't for celebrating another year of life. It was for closing a chapter, for drawing a line in the sand so deep, no tide of false sentiment could ever wash it away. I cooked, not with the frantic energy of past family gatherings, but with a calm, deliberate focus. Each dish was a statement, though only I knew its true meaning. David and Melissa arrived late, as expected, sweeping in with a gust of forced cheerfulness and flimsy excuses. "Happy birthday, Mom," Melissa chirped, shrugging off her expensive coat. "So sorry we're tardy. The traffic was just monstrous, and the bank has been an absolute madhouse lately. I didn't even have time to pick up a proper gift." She glanced around my small, tidy living room, with an air that barely concealed her disdain. I just smiled, a serene, knowing smile. "That's quite all right, dear. I'm just glad you could make it." Eric and his wife, Jenna, had arrived earlier. Jenna, a woman who mirrored Melissa's superficiality, quickly found common ground with her sister-in-law. While Eric was attempting to make polite conversation with Bill, who had, of course, been the first to arrive, bearing a thoughtful, handmade card from Susan, I overheard Melissa and Jenna in the dining nook. "Honestly, I don't know how she manages in this tiny place," Melissa whispered, loud enough for me to catch, gesturing vaguely at my clean but modest surroundings. "And the food? Well, it's homemade." Jenna snickered, scrolling idly through her phone. "Tell me about it. We're thinking of upgrading our kitchen. That new Italian marble countertop I saw on Pinterest is to die for. Maybe a long weekend in Napa next month to de-stress." Their chatter about shopping sprees and luxury vacations filled the air, a stark, ugly contrast to the recent memory of my desperate calls for help, my fear of ending up a cripple. I watched them, my resolve hardening with every vapid word. Dinner was a strained affair. David griped about tenure decisions at the university being tougher than a presidential race. Melissa lamented her micromanaging boss. Eric talked about some new electric tools his shop had supposedly just acquired, a story that rang hollow after what I'd overheard on the phone. I picked at my food, a faint smile playing on my lips, but inside, something heavy and unmoving had settled. David was mid-rant about his shrinking annual bonus when Melissa's phone, lying face up on the table, lit up with a notification. My eyes, as if drawn by a magnet, flicked to it, the lock screen. There it was again, the same sun-drenched beach in Hawaii, Melissa in her swimsuit, holding their son, Ben, palm trees swaying, the turquoise ocean sparkling, the picture they'd posted while I was lying in a hospital bed, terrified and alone, wondering how I'd pay for the surgery that would allow me to walk. The raw, visceral punch of that image, seen again in the context of their current complaints and casual cruelty, was the final spark. They said they had financial pressures, no extra money. But Hawaii happened, extravagant vacations happened, new kitchen countertops were being planned. My health, my ability to live without pain, that had been a bridge too far. I didn't explode, I didn't raise my voice. The simmering rage inside me had cooled, forged into something much harder, much more precise. I quietly sipped my water, letting their dinner table performance continue, each line perfectly rehearsed, polite, proper, and utterly, sickeningly hollow. Then, with a calmness that seemed to suck the air out of the room, I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping almost silently against the worn linoleum. I rose, my step steady, unhurried. Let the silence thicken. Let them feel the shift in the atmosphere. I walked towards my bedroom, a silent promise hanging in the air. The time for quiet endurance was over. The time for reckoning had arrived. I was going to get the box. I returned to the dining room, the deep brown wooden box held carefully in my hands. It wasn't large, but it felt immensely heavy, weighted with 20 years of unspoken truths and deferred justice. With each step, the forced conviviality of the room seemed to curdle, the silence growing thick and uneasy. I saw Melissa's eyes narrow slightly, her forced smile faltering. David stopped mid-sentence, his fork hovering over his plate. Eric looked up from his own meal, a flicker of something, curiosity, apprehension, in his eyes. Only Bill met my gaze steadily, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. I placed the box right in the center of the table, the polished wood gleaming dully under the overhead light. It might as well have been ticking. Jenna, Eric's wife, ever the one for superficialities, leaned forward, her eyes bright with a shallow curiosity. "Ooh, Grace, what's this? A birthday surprise for yourself?" Eric managed a nervous chuckle. "Don't tell me that's the famed family heirloom, Mum. The one you've been hiding all these years?" Melissa put down her phone, her earlier boredom replaced by a wary attentiveness. David simply stared, his brow furrowed. I ran my hand lightly over the smooth lid, my voice calm, deliberate, each word chosen with care. "This box," I began, my gaze sweeping over their faces, lingering for a moment on David, then Eric. "I've had it for more than 20 years, and today, on my birthday, I think it's time to open it. But before I do, I want to talk to you. Not as your mother, not as the woman who patched your knees and rocked you to sleep, but as a person, as Grace." The air in the room crackled. This was new. This wasn't the script they were used to. My mind flashed back, unbidden, to a school auditorium years ago. David, my golden child, standing on stage, beaming, a medal for academic excellence pinned to his chest. I remembered the surge of pride, so fierce it almost buckled my knees. I'd taken an unpaid half-day from the factory to be there, knowing I'd have to make up the hours on a grueling night shift. But his smile, his achievement, it had felt worth any sacrifice. I'd hugged him tight afterwards, the cheap fabric of my work dress rough against his new blazer. "Oh, David, I knew you could do it, son," I'd whispered, my heart overflowing. "You're so smart. Just remember, the most important thing is to be a good person." A good person. The words tasted like ash in my mouth now, looking at the man he'd become, the man who'd dismissed my desperate plea for help before jetting off to paradise, the man who, along with his brother, had so casually devalued my life, my pain. "All these years," I continued, my voice gaining a quiet strength, pulling me back to the charged silence of the dining room, "I raised you both, alone. From your first stumbling words to your college graduations, from your weddings to your new homes. I thought the love I poured into you, the sacrifices I made, without a second thought, would be returned with respect, with honor, with the simple human decency of remembering who was there for you when you had nothing." I let my gaze rest on each of them in turn. David, now looking down at his plate, Melissa, nervously shredding a napkin, Eric, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, Jenna, her curious smile frozen. "I thought," I said, my voice dropping slightly, each word landing with precision, "that if the day ever came when I truly needed you, you would be there." The unspoken, "but you weren't," hung heavy in the air, a new, uncomfortable truth taking its seat at our table. The contents of the box waited. And for the first time, I think they began to understand this wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. David finally dropped his gaze completely, staring intently at the pattern on his plate, as if it held the answers to the universe. Melissa clutched her napkin, her knuckles white, compulsively dabbing at a corner of her mouth that was already perfectly clean. Eric shifted in his seat, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a hunted look. Jenna simply looked from one face to another, her shallow curiosity curdling into unease. "It only took one surgery," I continued, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of all those unspoken years. "One moment of genuine, desperate need, to show me just how profoundly wrong I was about your loyalty, your respect, your love." I paused, letting the accusation settle. "David," I said, my eyes locking on to my eldest son. He flinched but didn't look up. "You told me things were tight. You told me you didn't have money to throw into a bottomless pit, my health, apparently, being that pit. Yet, mere days after I begged you for help, you and Melissa were sunning yourselves in Hawaii." I pulled out my phone then, the screen already displaying the screenshot of Melissa's beaming face on that sun-drenched beach, Ben by her side. I didn't need to show it to them again. The image was seared into my memory, and by now, I was sure, into theirs too. Melissa's face flushed a deep mottled red. "Grace, that's unfair," she stammered, her voice rising. "That trip was planned months ago. For Ben's sake, his allergies. The doctor recommended sea air. We couldn't just cancel. We would have lost all the money." "Ah," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "Ben's health. That, of course, is paramount. But my health, Melissa, my ability to simply walk without agonizing pain, that was an acceptable loss in the face of a non-refundable vacation package." David finally looked up, his face a mask of indignation. "Mom, you're blowing this out of proportion. We have jobs, lives, responsibilities too. You act like we were supposed to drop everything." "Your first responsibility, David," I cut him off, my voice still quiet but sharp as a shard of glass, "was to be a son, a human being, to remember who raised you, who sacrificed for you. You couldn't even grant me elementary trust when I told you, your own mother, that I was in dire straits. You suggested I was being scammed." I turned to Eric. "And you, Eric?" My voice was even lower now, colder. "You claimed cash flow was tight, that your business was suffocating. Yet, the week I was discharged from the hospital, still barely able to move, I had Martha drive me past your shop. I saw the new sign, the gleaming new tow truck you'd just acquired. And I distinctly remember hearing you on the phone, during my desperate call, discussing the arrival of a new plasma cutter. Those aren't the actions of a man whose business is failing." Eric looked down, his ears burning a furious red. He mumbled something about investments, about needing to spend money to make money, his words strained, clawing their way up his throat. Mom, I didn't mean I didn't want to help, I was just scared. If I gave it to you and, well, if you couldn't pay it back. A laugh escaped me then, cold and sharp. So, my worth as your mother boils down to whether or not I can repay a $10,000 loan. After a lifetime of me skipping meals, working double shifts, wearing patched-up coats so you two could have new school clothes, new opportunities, after nights spent by your sickbeds, holding your hands while you cried. Bill, who had been sitting quietly, a thundercloud of disapproval on his face, finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice, but his words cut through the room's strained silence, addressed directly to my sons. Your mother, he said, his tone heavy with a lifetime of respect for me and profound disappointment in them, is a golden woman. She worked her fingers to the bone for you boys, sacrificed everything. And you, he simply shook his head, a gesture more damning than any tirade. The air was thick with their shame, their stuttered excuses, their dawning horror. I let them stew in it for a moment longer. Then, I placed both my hands firmly on the lid of the wooden box. This box, I said, my voice resonating with a newfound power, has seen more of my tears and sleepless nights than either of you could ever imagine. Every single dollar that once resided in here, every entry in the passbook it now contains, represents hours of my labor, pieces of my health, countless dreams I deferred for your sake. I saved meticulously for what I called a rainy day. I always imagined that rainy day would be some unforeseen illness, some catastrophic repair to the house, or simply the quiet indignities of old age. My gaze swept over them again, cold and unwavering, but I was wrong. My real rainy day. It was the day I realized that my own sons cared more about their comfort, their vacations, their new toys, than whether their mother would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. Their faces were pale now, all pretense of indignation gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening understanding. The box remained closed, but its presence dominated the room, a silent judge, a harbinger of what was to come. The pre-climax tension was at its peak. My fingers, steady now, found the small tarnished brass clasp on the front of the wooden box. It opened with a faint click, a sound that seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence of the room. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay 2 neat stacks of cash, more money than my sons probably thought I possessed, an old-style bank passbook, its pages filled with careful, spidery entries, and a single sheet of slightly yellowed, stationery, my will, the one I'd had drawn up by a lawyer a decade ago, when the first chilling drafts of their indifference had begun to seep under the door of my heart, and updated just weeks ago with a firm, unwavering hand. You speak of your responsibilities, your tight finances, your busy lives, I said, my voice even, devoid of tremor. Let me tell you about my responsibilities, the ones I upheld, and the ones I now have to myself. I picked up the yellowed sheet of paper. This document, legally signed, witnessed, and notarized, outlines the distribution of my estate, my house, my savings, everything I've worked for. I saw Melissa lean forward, a greedy light flickering in her eyes, quickly masked by a show of concerned attentiveness. David and Eric exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. It's quite simple, really, I continued, meeting each of their gazes in turn. I, Grace Eleanor Walker, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare the following. Half of my entire estate shall be gifted to Mr. William Simmons, in profound gratitude for his unwavering friendship, his unquestioning support, and for an act of kindness that, quite literally, saved my life when my own blood turned their backs. Bill looked genuinely startled, then a slow flush rose up his neck. He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand. The remaining half, I went on, my voice unwavering, is reserved entirely for my own care, my own comfort, and my own living expenses for whatever time I have left. A significant portion will also establish a scholarship fund for deserving young people entering trade schools, a donation to the Harbour Machinery Retirement Union, and a small trust for my kind young neighbour, Sarah, the girl who shovels my walk-in. Winter and checks in on me every Wednesday, rain or shine, without ever being asked. I paused, letting the words sink in. No other familial claims, I stated, the final words delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel, shall be recognized or entertained. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum into which all sound, all breath had been sucked. Then it shattered. Melissa was the first to snap, her voice shrill, incredulous. "Grace, are you seriously giving your house and all your savings to him? To strangers? What about your family? What about Ben, your grandson?" I looked at her, this woman who had so easily dismissed my suffering, with a calm that seemed to unnerve her more than any rage could have. "I am repaying a debt of true kindness, Melissa. Bill helped me when I had nothing but fear and pain, asked no questions, set no conditions. He showed up. As for family," my gaze flickered to David, then Eric. "You, my sons, showed me exactly how deep my loneliness truly ran, even when surrounded by those who are supposed to love me." Eric shot to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of panic and belated remorse. Mom, I was wrong, okay? I was stupid. That day you called, I had the money." He fumbled in his wallet, pulling out a crumpled check, thrusting it towards me with a shaking hand. "Here, 10,000. Please, Mom, take it. Let me make it right." I looked at the check, then at his desperate face. A sad smile touched my lips. "Now, Eric, now you want to fix it." I gently pushed his hand, and the check, back towards him. "You think this was ever just about the money?" My voice wasn't loud, but it struck them like a physical blow, clean, direct, inescapable. "All my life, I saved and scraped so you could have more, be more. I gave you my time, my energy, my health. I worked those night shifts, skipped doctor's visits, hoarded every penny to build something for you. But when I needed you, when I truly needed just a fraction of that support in return, you said you were busy. You said you had no money. You questioned my honesty, my sanity. You couldn't even offer me your trust." David's face had turned a deep, furious crimson. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mom, how can you be so cruel?" he choked out, his voice thick with outrage. "We're your sons." I looked up at him, my golden child, the boy I'd had such high hopes for. There was no anger left in me, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. "Sons," I said softly, the word a quiet question. "Tell me, David, do you know who sat with me in that sterile hospital room for over 2 weeks after the surgery? Who asked if I was in pain, if I needed another blanket, if I wanted just a sip of water? Your concern, and Eric's, never made it past your phone screens, a few hollow texts. Meanwhile, Bill, who you consider a stranger, who isn't family by your definition, came every few days. He brought fruit. He sat with me. He listened. He cared." I slowly closed the lid of the wooden box, the faint click echoing the finality of my decision. The battle was over. The truth had been spoken. I stood up, my hand resting briefly on the back of my chair, the old wood familiar beneath my touch. The faces around the table were a blur of shock, disbelief, and dawning, unwelcome understanding. David stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped. Eric looked as if I'd physically struck him. Melissa was openly weeping now, no longer the shrill, indignant wife, but a woman watching her comfortable future dissolve. "Mom, wait," Eric stammered, rushing to my side as I turned towards the door. "Where are you going? We can talk about this. Fix this." "There's nothing left to fix, Eric," I said, my voice gentle but firm, without a trace of the anger that had fueled me moments before. It had burned away, leaving behind a clean, quiet space. "I've made my arrangements. I'll be moving into the Riverbend retirement community with Bill. It's quiet there, peaceful. There's a garden, good company, friends." "Mom!" David finally called out, his voice cracking with something that might have been regret, or perhaps just the sound of his own entitlements shattering. I didn't look back. I reached the front door and pulled it open. Warm afternoon sunlight spilled across my shoulders, soft and golden, like a benediction. "You won't need to worry about taking care of me anymore," I said, my words drifting back into the stunned silence of the room. "You don't have to answer my calls. You don't even have to remember my birthday." As I stepped over the threshold, out of that house filled with so many years of my labor, and now, so much bitter truth, a profound sense of peace settled over me. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I saw things with an almost painful clarity. Real happiness isn't found in begging for love from those who are incapable of giving it freely. It's found in knowing that when you fall, someone worthy will reach out, not because they are obligated by blood, but because they care with their soul. That wooden box hadn't just held legal papers and stacks of cash. It had held the final opportunity for my sons to see me, to value me. And that opportunity, like the youth I'd spent raising them, had now irrevocably passed. They could have their Hawaiian paradises, their new plasma cutters, their illusions. I had just reclaimed mine.